It's the night of April the 14th, 1912, and the Titanic is on its maiden voyage. All the crew know that ice might be sighted. However, it's a moonless, quiet, starlit night with no cloud. The sea is as still as a mill pond. Not a breath of wind, and the sea like a sheet of glass, making the detection of icebergs very difficult. A telegram is received on the Titanic's wireless, warning all ships of heavy icebergs in an area just ahead of the Titanic. However, the second officer and the one on watch, Charles Lightoller, never receives the communication, and the ship steams on at 22 knots. At 10 p.m. he was relieved by First Officer William Murdoch and retires below. A bell sharply rings out from the crow's nest 3 times, and the call is heard, "Ice right ahead, sir!" The command is given, "Hard a starboard, full speed astern!" But it's too late, and the ship has been struck as ice falls on the foredeck. No one knows the ship has been pierced 6 or more times below the waterline on the starboard side. From this moment, nothing can save her. Lightoller, on his bunk, feels a slight jar, a shiver that ran through the ship. The fourth officer puts his head around the door and says, "Do you know we struck an iceberg? The water is up to F deck in the mailroom." Lightoller runs up to the deck. The ship is stopped, and the steam from all the boilers is roaring through the exhausts. The noise is deafening. Lightoller sees the captain, cups his hands over his ear and shouts, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" The captain nods, and Charles sets about loading the lifeboats, strictly enforcing the women and children first protocol, only allowing men to board the lifeboats in the capacity of auxiliary seamen. Everyone, including Charles at this stage, thought it was just a precautionary measure, and the ship wouldn't founder. In his book, he recounted, "Actually, the Titanic was so constructed and divided into watertight compartments that she would float with any 2 compartments full of water, and the margin of safety made it fairly certain that she would still have floated, even with 3 of the 4 forward compartments full up. Although I was fairly confident in my own mind that she would not sink, one has no right to risk an error of judgment that may entail loss of life, particularly when it is the case of the passengers you are carrying." As it turned out, she was holed in no less than 6 compartments along the starboard side, and nothing could have saved her. By the time half the boats were gone, the bow started to go lower, and the creeping dread of the high water made it clear that it was only time before she would slip beneath the surface. The band started playing, "Nearer My God to Thee." Attempting to launch a lifeboat, Charles found it was already occupied by 25 male passengers. He forced them out of the boat, yelling, "Get out of there, you damn cowards! I'd like to see every one of you overboard!" The boat was lowered successfully, although some were not filled to capacity, in part due to concerns that the winch system would not take the weight of a fully loaded lifeboat. The last boat was a collapsible raft stowed upside down on the officers' quarters. Lightoller and another seaman cut the life raft free and threw it down on the water, which was now above the boat deck. The Titanic took a sudden dip, and people were washed into the sea. Charles started to swim away but got sucked down and trapped against a grate. That would have been the end for Lightoller had a boiler not exploded. In the swirling mass of water, he got pushed back up to the surface and found himself near the collapsible raft he had released earlier. The raft was upside down, but Charles hung onto a rope attached to it. The cables holding one of the Titanic's gigantic funnels gave way, and the huge funnel fell into the icy water, missing Charles by inches. The impact washed the raft clear of the sinking ship. There were about 30 people who scrambled aboard the upturned raft, including Lightoller. Taking charge, he watched as the huge liner sunk to the depths below. He later credited his faith with his survival and said, "With God, all things are possible." After being rescued and as the most senior member of the crew to return from that fateful voyage, Lightoller was called to testify in several inquiries. There was suspicion that his testimony wasn't completely truthful, and there was a certain amount of shame attached to being the most senior officer to survive, which must have been hard to bear. In 1916, he was in the Royal Navy and captain of a torpedo boat. The boat was in the Thames estuary when it encountered the L-31 Zeppelin. These super Zeppelins were a triumph of German engineering. They were vast at almost 200 meters long and 24 meters wide and had been wreaking havoc in London. Lightoller decided to lie in wait in the Thames and ready the anti-aircraft gun with a tracer round. From his book, in his own words, he said, "Amongst my signalmen, I had a chap who had the most extraordinary acute hearing. I've known him to hear and describe sounds quite outside the ken of anyone on board. I told number one to put him on the bridge with nothing else to do but to keep his ears open. Only 10 minutes later, he signaled that he could hear something, and the Zeppelin airship loomed into view immediately above the boat. A battle took place and 2 tracers hit the Zeppelin in the tail. In return, the airship dropped a storm of bombs, in part in retaliation, but also to lighten the load so that the ship could rise and escape. Lightoller said, "How on earth we didn't set him on fire and bring him down, heaven alone knows. Just absolute rotten bad luck." The Zeppelin was forced to withdraw and got away, but the encounter and his actions earned Charles the Distinguished Service Cross. He was later given command of HMS Gary, a river-class destroyer. One of the more darker points in Lightoller's career occurred during this time, when as captain he was accused of a brutal incident. He had successfully depth-charged, rammed and sunk a U-boat. The surviving crew were swimming, and Lightoller would not accept their surrender. What's more, the crew of the Gary allegedly opened fire on the survivors under the orders of its captain. In his memoirs, the commander of the U-boat said that this continued until other ships arrived, at which point, as if by magic, the British now let down some lifeboats into the water. Lightoller never admitted the incident, but later wrote in his memoirs, "Towards the submarine men, one felt an utter disgust and loathing. They were nothing but an abomination, polluting the clean sea." After the war, Charles Lightoller retired and purchased a motor yacht called the Sundowner. He wrote an autobiography, Titanic and Other Ships, which sold well until Marconi forced the book to be removed from sale due to his comments on the role of the Marconi radio operators in the Titanic disaster. In 1939, at the outbreak of war, his youngest son, Herbert, became one of the first casualties of the conflict and was killed in action on the 4th of September. Herbert was in the Royal Air Force and had spoken to his father about aviation, and in particular the process of how a plane targets a ship. Charles listened and learned, a lesson that was particularly useful when in 1940 the Sundowner was requisitioned by the Navy to help with the evacuation of Dunkirk. He was told to take his motor yacht to Ramsgate, where he would give the boat to a Navy crew. He refused, saying, "If anyone was going to take her over, well, my eldest son and I were." Charles set off to cross the English Channel with his eldest son, Roger, and a 19-year-old Sea Scout. The boat was licensed to carry 21 passengers. Charles loaded the ship with 127 servicemen, 75 below deck and the rest on top. On the way back, they were attacked by a Stuka. Charles remembered what his son Herbert had told him and stood on the bow. As the Stuka screamed down and lined up his bombing run, Charles waited and watched, and at the last possible moment, he yelled out to turn the boat, and the bomb splashed harmlessly on the starboard side of the Sundowner. Returning to Ramsgate, he unloaded the men where the chief petty officer exclaimed to Charles, "My God, mate, where did you put 'em?" If parts of this story sound familiar, in 2017 Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk was released, where the character Mr. Dawson, played by Mark Rylance, was inspired by Charles Lightoller. Lightoller died in 1952, but his motor yacht, the Sundowner, can be visited today in the Ramsgate Maritime Museum.
Sorry, Jack. There is only room for 2. Draw me like your French ladies.